And good morning once again, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to at Virtual AP US History. Mr. Horton, I'm from just outside of Buffalo, New York, where it's been snowing the last couple of days. Hopefully it's not so snowy in your part of the world. And we're going to pick up where Ms. Farr left off yesterday. She'll be on the, she's on the Twitter this morning and already has a Twitter poll question out there for you as we go through the Civil War here and continue on our journey through Unit 5 of the course. So we're going to get right on to that and talk about the Civil War and some of the outcomes of the Civil War, and then Ms. Farr will wrap that up for us tomorrow. So without any further ado here, let's get right on to the topic of the day. And if you are new with us here at Virtual AP US History, there is a Twitter feed sorry about that, I'll get that where it's supposed to be. Let's try that. There's a Twitter feed at Virtual APUSH where you can tweet questions. You can also get some information there. There's some review sheets that Ms. Farr has been really nice about making available to you. On that on Twitter, and there's also some links to the rubric for the new exam. So lesson overview, we're going to talk really about the American Civil War. The main skill for today is primary source analysis. We're going to look at some primary sources along the way here, including some excerpts from the Gettysburg Address towards the end of the lesson. Overriding question, why did the North win the Civil War? What was the war really all about? And that is the million-dollar question with the Civil War. So at the end of the lesson, we really have a couple of key points I hope that you get: the chain of events that ends up starting the Civil War, the reasons why the North won the war, how the war was waged on both sides, and we'll see that that's a version of total wars, as we'll see, and how the goals of the war changed over the course of the Civil War. So let's get into that. Part one, Lincoln's election and secession. So some background stuff here to kind of connect with yesterday's lesson. Ms. Farr talked a lot about the expansion of slavery and the expansion of the United States becoming an issue, and the Compromise of 1850, which among other things, one of the elements of that compromise is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which strengthens the federal government's role in that. Well, a Northern woman writes this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It really, in reaction to that law, she's being critical of the fugitive slave law in this book, and this is a wildly popular book, really important part of the cause of the American Civil War, because it made Northerners it made them less neutral on the issue of slavery, might be one way of putting it. So they might not have been abolitionists, but they certainly became anti-slavery after reading this book, which tugged at people's heartstrings about the horrors of slavery and people trying to run away from slavery. So this begins to stir up that anti-slavery sentiment even more in the North. Then in 1854, you have the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which again, similar to the Compromise of 1850, you have another step forward, if you want to think of it that way, for slavery, or a possibility of the expansion of slavery. And the other piece of the Missouri Compromise basically gets eliminated by this. So they would take this line and basically take it off the map, because now Kansas and Nebraska could potentially be open to slavery by popular sovereignty. We're going to let the people that live in those states decide whether they're going to have slavery or not. And so that Missouri Compromise line that seemed to be the thing that resolved the issue is no longer in effect. It's gone as a result of this. So this is going to make Northerners even more angry. And in fact, this will ultimately lead to the creation of a new political party called the Republican Party. And they are dedicated to the idea of free soil, stopping the spread of slavery into the Western territories. So you have the two main parties at the time. The Whigs are going to eventually fall apart, and the Democrats. So the Whigs are going to collapse. So that second party system, as they sometimes refer to it, is going to be gone, and the Whigs eventually will be replaced by the Republican Party. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act leads to all kinds of issues, including what is sometimes referred to as Bleeding Kansas, where you have pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers in that region that that are trying to turn Kansas either into a free state or a slave state, and they begin to kill one another. So essentially you have a civil war 4 years before the actual Civil War itself begins. And again, this is going to, a lot of these late 1850s issues are really stirring people up more and more and more about over the issue of slavery. And I noticed on our first Twitter poll question, what's the most important cause of the Civil War? About half of you said slavery. And slavery, I think, is intimately entwined with all of these things that we're talking about. So you have violence in Kansas. We might call this foreshadowing if we were teaching an English course for the Civil War. You have an incident in Congress where a pro-slavery congressman beats an anti-slavery congressman, primarily because of the things he said in a speech about Kansas. The speech was actually titled "A Crime Against Kansas." So now you have congressmen, beating each other up on the floor of the House of Representatives. I mean, imagine if today, you had an actual fight between two congressmen, and actually the pro-slavery, the anti-slavery congressman, Sumner, ends up spending about 3 years in the hospital trying to recover from the head wounds as a result of this whole thing. So, and again, connecting back to Kansas here, definitely connecting back to the issue of slavery. Then we have the Dred Scott decision, which is a really important, I think, turning point just before the Civil War happens. Dred Scott was a slave that was moved to a free territory. And after his master died, he sued and said, hey, I'm living in a territory that outlaws slavery. I shouldn't be a slave anymore. And the decision in that case was a very controversial decision. The Chief Justice, Roger Taney, who's the guy you see on the screen here, basically said, African Americans aren't citizens, they can't be citizens. Therefore, their property can't be taken away from somebody without just compensation, which is a protection in the actual Constitution. So African Americans are property, therefore he has no civil rights. But then he goes on, Taney does, to say that Congress doesn't really have the right to ban slavery in any territory. So this really takes the Missouri Compromise and finishes it off once and for all. So no longer can the federal government deny your right to take a slave with you to a territory, which Northerners, especially free soil Northerners, are really going to detest this decision, because what they're basically saying is that, hey, you can't decide whether you want to have slavery or not. A person's right to own slaves is much more important than actual human rights. Very, very controversial decision, probably one of the worst decisions of the Supreme Court ever, as you can see from the things that are written here about that. And again, if it's going to fire people up, Northerners say, well, we're not going to follow that. Southerners get angry because, well, if you're not going to follow the law, then why should we? And that's, again, another step towards this, more and more anger about this issue of slavery. John Brown's raid. John Brown is a character. He's certainly an intriguing character. Some people refer to him today as a freedom fighter or a terrorist. Some teachers actually spend a little time talking about that whole thing. But John Brown proposed and ultimately did try to raid a federal arsenal. And he thinks he's going to take all these guns and head south and encourage a massive slave uprising and end slavery in the United States once and for all. And that attempt falls short. He gets captured at Harper's Ferry. He gets surrounded, actually arrested by a guy named Robert E. Lee, who we'll hear about a little bit more later. And because he isn't killed in the attack, he becomes sort of a martyr to the cause, because throughout his trial, he very expertly uses the media, and he turns the case around on the pro-slavery side and basically says, that I'm fighting for people that have nobody else fighting for them. And some abolitionist Northerners looked at him as this great hero. He literally put his life on the line to try to end slavery in the United States. And he ultimately is executed for fomenting slave rebellion. And some Northerners even aren't willing to go quite as far as John Brown was. And Southerners, of course, viewed Brown as a terrorist. I mean, he's a guy that's threatening to come and end slavery in their region, to create a racial war, some of them would argue. So again, the emotion is really getting out of control here with them. So to summarize, the causes of the Civil War, really, slavery, as many of you identified as the #1 issue. I would agree. The nature of union is the union a country of all people are united by the national government, or are we a union that is made up of states? This whole old states' rights philosophy. that Ms. Farr talked about yesterday, or 2 days ago, rather, excuse me, with Jackson and the whole nullification crisis that should states be able to decide what laws they want to follow and what laws they don't want to follow. The fact that the North and the South were developing in different directions. The North was more urban and more industrial. The South was more rural, based on slavery, more aristocratic. And some historians actually make the argument that it's because of extremists and that come to the fore. So people like John Brown that we just saw, people like Preston Brooks, who's the guy that beat up the anti-slavery congressman. The fact that these people are leaders as opposed to the old Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, those guys are all dead by the mid 1850s. So, and the folks that replace them aren't really as great of leaders, is another argument for why the Civil War ultimately ended up happening. So a practice question from yesterday really was covered in the Twitter feed. What was the most important cause of the Civil War? So you could get a question about this on the exam to analyze the relative importance of the causes. Which thing would you say is the most important? Is it sectionalism? Is it slavery? Is it the rise of these extremists or the people that are less able to compromise? What's the reason that this ultimately ended up happening? So the election of 1860 really is the beginning of the Civil War in one sense, that the election features the Democratic Party disintegrating. It splits in two. The Southerners actually named their own candidate. So you actually have two Democrats running in this election. Stephen Douglas is the Northern Democrat. John Breckinridge is the Southern Democrat. And Lincoln runs as the candidate of the Republican Party. And you can see that some of the issues that he campaigned on, denouncing the John Brown raid. He believes in not interfering in slavery where it already exists. This is very much the free soil position on slavery. So Lincoln, as we'll get into a little bit in a second here, comes to the presidency ultimately by winning the most heavily populated states, and you can tell that from the map here. So this sort of greenish color, you can see New York State, my home state, is the largest state in the Union, at least population-wise by this point. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana and Illinois here, these are the really heavily populated states. Massachusetts, those states voted for Lincoln. And the Democrats, of course, take the South here. John Breckinridge wins the South. Interestingly, this sort of compromise candidate, John Bell, he takes the Middle South. More on that in a little bit. And Lincoln becomes president. And so some Southern states, especially South Carolina, view this as a threat. So Lincoln wins in December of 1860. And South Carolina decided to secede from the Union in December of that same year. So much like we saw with the nullification crisis a couple of days ago, South Carolina is upset. They feel like the national government no longer represents them, and so they're going to leave. And by February of 1861, 6 other Deep South states seceded from the Union, and they form a new government that was called the Confederate States of America. So, and this is all before Lincoln actually takes the oath of office. Lincoln doesn't get to become president until March 4th, because that was the inauguration day in those days. So there's this chain of events that begins to happen, where you have a country, at least from the Southern point of view, a new country being formed out of the ashes of the old, called the Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America. And you can see this is a great little map here that shows you that the South is not 100% unified on the issue of secession. You can see there's places, for example, up here in the western part of Virginia. Tennessee is very much split on the issue of secession. And these are the states that ultimately did secede from the Union that we can see here. So this is not a 100% proposition, certainly, as you can see by the divisions on the map. So let's do a little practice, a couple primary sources here. So let's ask you to read this, and what is the argument being made in the passage? And we'll start the timer. So here we have South Carolina. This is their declaration, almost like a Declaration of Independence. They're explaining to us, here's why we're seceding. And I think the key pieces here, it says, thus was established by compact between the states, a government with defined objects and powers, that states retained powers, that their argument is the national government has overstepped its authority. And or is threatening to overstep its authority, and that the union is based on an agreement of the states. And much like the Declaration suggested that people give up their rights to a government, they're essentially arguing that the states have given up. The states have given up. Lost my train of thought there. Sorry about that. The states have given up some power to the national government in order to have security, and that the states then could take that power back, which is essentially what they're doing here. Is they're seceding from the union. They're saying we no longer believe that we belong to the union. All right, let's try another one. This is a couple short quotes from Lincoln's first inaugural address. So let's try to figure out what is he saying to these southern states. So, and then we'll do the sourcing part here after you get done reading that. So we'll get the timer started there. All right. So what is Lincoln saying here? And so if we wanted to source this document, what's the historical situation, or what's the point of view, or what's the purpose? What's Lincoln up to here? So these might be some answers to those questions. So what's the historical situation? Well, it's the election of 1860 has just happened, and the states of South Carolina and 6 other deep South states have seceded. That's what's going on when Lincoln gives this speech. What's his point of view? That he will not interfere with slavery in the South. He's trying to reassure the South that as he says here, I believe I have no lawful right to interfere with slavery where it exists. So he's trying to reassure them, right? Purpose, trying to prevent the possibility of a civil war. And who's his intended audience? Now he's really speaking to Southerners, right? That you really have nothing to fear by me becoming your president, that I'm not going to interfere with slavery. And of course, at this point, those states are gone from the Union, and they're probably not going to change their mind at this point. So, okay. So the chain of events continues. Eventually, Fort Sumter gets fired on. This is one of the federal forts that had not been seized by the Confederates. It sits in the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina. Lincoln sends supplies to the men that are there, but not more weapons. Southerners view that as an aggressive action, so they fire upon the fort. The fact that the South fires the first shot unifies the North in their determination to do something about this. And then Lincoln called for volunteers to build up the army to put down this rebellion or insurrection, as he referred to it. And this causes 4 more southern states to secede from the Union. More of the upper South states you can see here, Tennessee, Virginia, for example. Arkansas. So not quite the deep South, but the middle South, those states that were kind of on the fence about secession. In many ways, this sort of makes up their mind for them. So this is an image of Fort Sumter, which is the beginning of the fighting against between the North and the South. This is actually a drawing from that time. So what is this cartoonist's point of view about secession? So we'll get the timer started here and let you think about that for 40 seconds. Some good symbols in this cartoon. So you've got the eagle, and I don't know if you noticed that the nest is made out of the American flag. So of course you have this sort of sense of unity that they're all wrapped around it. And the eagle is saying annihilation to traitors. So hopefully you recognize that this is a cartoon that is very against secession. Or it's a pro-Northern perspective or an anti-secessionist perspective, that secession equals being a traitor. It's kind of the idea of that. So let's move on to part 2 of today. So military aspects of the war. There's 2 sort of pieces of that whole story. Really a big part of the story is why the North wins. So one answer is that the border states ultimately remain loyal to the Union. So the purple states in this map are the border states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, that were slave states that remained loyal to the Union. And Lincoln very much understood that the border states were important to the overall cause of the war. Maryland, if Maryland secedes from the Union, then Washington, D.C. is in the Confederacy. So that's really important to keep them on board. But Kentucky, with all the material advantages or the material gains that we get by having Kentucky on our side, Lincoln actually once said, I hope to have God on my side, but I have to have Kentucky. That's how important he certainly viewed that state as part of the effort here. So you have some pro-slave states that do remain with the Union. They choose not to secede. And remember that map that we looked at a little bit ago about where, which regions of the states decided to secede and which ones did not. That sort of parallels this at least a little bit. West Virginia, you'll notice, is its own color because West Virginia was a pro-slavery region that did not want to secede. So they actually seceded from Virginia, and Lincoln allowed them to create their own state, which is sort of ironic because he's fighting a war against secession, but he allows these counties to form their own state because they wanted to stay on our side. Good job to Alexandro Diaz for getting the question about who's the first president of the Confederacy, actually the only president of the Confederacy. Got that question first. So one reason is the border states, these pro-slave states, these sort of I don't know what color that is. They're slave states that remain loyal to the Union. And if you think about, the war took 4 years with those states on the Union side ultimately. So certainly an important part of the story. Definitely material advantages. So here's a question for Twitter. Based on this chart, what are the 2 advantages that the South has based on this chart? What are the 2 things that the South has more of than the North? So when you're looking at this chart, see how many of you get this right on Twitter. The blue lines, of course, are the North, which is typically associated with the Union. The gray lines are the South, which is gray is typically associated with the Confederacy. You'll notice that the North doesn't have very much cotton. About 0.1% of all the cotton in the United States. Almost all of it is in the South. That's one advantage that they have. And the other advantage, at least material advantage, is donkeys and mules. About 70% or so in the South versus about 29% in the North. The other things, the banks, the factories, the food, the railroads, I mean, these are all advantages that the North has, and those will be important in the war. So one argument you could make, and we'll just kind of skip through this question, but one argument you could make if you look at the railroad lines here in this map, you see why the Northwest sided with the North. There's another reason. They're connected with the North, and you can see how much more railroad tracks were built in the North as opposed to the South. And if you study the Civil War and understand tactics and stuff, a lot of the Civil War battles in the South focused around important junctions of railroad lines because there really weren't that many of them in the South, as you can see from the map. So another reason why the North won is that the South was blockaded. The North prevented the South from selling cotton overseas. They tried to prevent European powers from aiding the Confederacy by blockading the main ports. The British are sort of toying around with interfering in the war. They do things like sell blockade running ships to the South and the French install a dictator in Mexico named Maximilian, and so there's some concern that maybe France might aid the Confederacy. So this helps to prevent that from happening. So there's sort of two angles of the Southern blockade. One is we want to make sure the South can't sell cotton, which they clearly had the vast majority of in the United States based on that chart. And we also want to make sure that England and France don't step in and help the Confederates, which would be a problem, of course, for the North of one war at a time. Okay, population advantage. So this is a great chart that shows you that. So the North has about 3/4 of the population of the United States versus the South that has about roughly a little more than 1/4. But notice how it's broken down in the chart here, that in the South, of the 9 million people living in the South, about 4 million of them are slaves. Keep that in mind for a little bit later in our lesson today. So the North already outnumbers the people in the South, but then you also have this sort of sub-context of what's going on in the South, that about 4 million, so there's only about 5 million white people in the South that can fight on this against the Union, where the Union has about 4 times that number of people. When you look at the overall story here. So population advantage is an important part of this. So why the North wins. Another reason is the strategy known as the Anaconda Plan. Great job. Just about to ask this question, and Ms. Farr already read my mind here. So Alexandro Diaz got this one right on Twitter. That's the name of the plan, Anaconda, named after the snake. So the idea is to blockade the ports and to cut the Confederacy in half by capturing the Mississippi River. And you can see kind of the way this map is sort of laid out. The yellowish areas up here are the areas that are sort of gained by the Union in 1861. By 1862, we have a good chunk of the upper Mississippi here. By 1863, you can see that the whole Mississippi is now really under the control of the Union. As well as more of the South. Then the purple in 1864, where we cut the South in half again this way, and then 1865, of course, the war ends. So this idea of kind of wrapping around the South like a snake. And the other piece of the puzzle here is to capture Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederacy. It gets moved there after Virginia secedes from the Union. So there's a great little Twitter trivia question for you. What was the original capital of the Confederacy? So Richmond becomes the capital after Virginia secedes, but there was actually a capital before that. So we'll see if you know that. So early on, the Confederacy wins a lot of battles. So the Confederates are winning primarily because of the guy you see here, General Robert E. Lee. He is outsmarting the Union at every step. And it's one of the things that Lincoln will struggle with, is to try to find a general that can actually win some battles. So, and I listed some battles here for you if you're interested in Civil War battles and stuff. We're not going to get into the details of those, but the South is winning. They're defending their home ground. They believe that they have the right cause, and they have good generals. I mean, they definitely had the advantage of generals early on in the war there. So, and General Lee is the main reason why they're winning a lot of those battles, as you can see here, that I listed on the screen. So, little dad joke here for you. Civil War jokes, I generally don't find them funny. But all right, moving on. The Union turns the tide in the war, and so some things begin to turn in the Union's favor. And General Grant ultimately becomes the leader of the Union Army in the East. He makes a name for himself in the West, capturing Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in 1862. He also is going to capture Vicksburg, which opens up the Mississippi in July of 1863. And Lincoln eventually will move him to the Eastern Theater, where he pursues the Confederates and really grinds down their army by using the population advantage that the North has. So eventually, the North is going to find a general that is going to do what it's going to take to ultimately win the war. Now, how do the two sides go about fighting the war? Well, one way is a draft, and you can see a little comparison here. Liliana Gordon, good job. Montgomery was the original capital of the Confederacy. So in the chart that you see here, the North is on the left and the South is on the right, and it shows you the difference in the draft between the two. So the North doesn't actually even begin a draft until 1863, where the South has to do that earlier, full year earlier. Notice that both sides also allowed wealthy people to hire substitutes to go in their place. So this is where you get that very famous saying that it's a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. So people, John D. Rockefeller is a great example of a person who in the North was drafted but paid for a substitute to go in his place. One result of that in the North was a riot against the draft, took place in New York City in 1863. And so you see that on the home front, this map shows you some of the main events of those draft riots that took place that summer, shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg. Um, Ironically, some of the troops from Gettysburg were sent to New York City to put down this rebellion. But so you have some people in the North that aren't 100% on board with this. There's some resistance to that. Just like in the South, you have some resistance to the war effort. There are a series of riots called bread riots that took place in the South as food became more and more scarce. And you see sort of the comparison here in the cartoon on the left, you have the Southern belles. They're all dressed up in their pretty gowns here, and they're sending their men off to war, and it's a glorious sort of thing. And on the right, you can see how things have changed there, that these women are now not quite dressed the way they were before, and they're smashing into windows of a bakery in order to get food to feed their families. So the South also experienced some internal turmoil over what was going on. So this is important to remember that on both sides, they're dealing with these problems on the home front. General Sherman eventually makes a march through the South. It's called the March to the Sea, capturing Atlanta and eventually Savannah. He cuts loose from his supply lines to do this, which is kind of unprecedented in war. And he decides to wage what he called total war against the South. So he is tearing up railroad tracks, as you can see in the image here. They're taking food, they're burning any supplies that they can't take with them. They're really trying to, as he said, make the South howl, to make the South feel the pain of the war. And of course, this is kind of a controversial thing, especially in the 1800s, because the rules of war in those days were that you tried to avoid hurting civilians in the course of a war. And that's, of course, not what they're doing here. You can see they're tearing down the telegraph cables here and all those, basically ruining everything that's in the South's economy. And here's the map or the route of Sherman's march. He eventually makes his way to Savannah. He gives a nice Christmas present to Lincoln by winning that city, where he is met by the Union Navy. And eventually he's going to make his way north and link up with the Union troops that are fighting in Virginia. And you can see just to think about the cost of this war, the casualties of this war compared to all the other wars in American history. If you add up all the other wars in American history, the Civil War still outpaces that. And that number 620 is actually a little bit more of a conservative number. Some people think it's actually higher than that. Even compared to World War II, we often think of that as a much, much more deadly war, which it was not. So a couple exam practice questions. Let's take a look at a little chart here. So a couple multiple choices. So get the timer started. So when we're interpreting a chart here, one of the easier ways to deal with this is to go through and just mark off the ones that you know aren't true. So if we look at this, for example, A, Confederate forces suffered more casualties. So let's look around here. What do we have? Oh, casualties, people that are wounded and killed. Does the Confederacy have more? No, not on this chart. So we know that can't be the answer. So the best answer here is D. Confederate armies lost a greater proportion of their soldiers, percentage-wise, than the North. So this is a little bit of a math thing that you'd have to kind of figure out. So let's do this one. The data in the top table indicates what about professions of soldiers in the Civil War? Okay, and I don't even think we need the whole time here. So hopefully you're seeing that B is the answer. The much greater percentage of farmers fought for the South than did for the North. And the last one. This is a good example of be careful about making assumptions from a chart. So example, more educated leadership. We really don't know, we can't tell that from the chart. C is definitely the best answer out of these. So let's move on to chapter or part 3 of the final segment of our story, government policies during the war. So one of the issues that comes about early on in the war for the Union side is what to do with runaway slaves. So questions arose as to what to do with former slaves. Do we return them to the Southern owners? And some of the Southern owners actually believed that the Union Army would return the slaves to them, suggesting that, well, they're property and you can't take my property away. And one of the Union generals actually said, well, you know, you seceded from the Union, so we don't follow those rules for you. Do we take them for labor as slaves in the Union Army? Do we free them? Do we free them and give them weapons? Those are all questions that the Union is going to have to deal with. So actually, Congress eventually is going to pass a law called the Confiscation Act. It did not free the slaves, but simply switch control over them from Confederates to the Union if they made it to the Union lines. And now the second Confiscation Act a year later does free runaways. So you can see that even Congress is beginning to make they're taking some steps forward towards ending slavery and making slavery one of the issues of the war. Lincoln started the Civil War only to save the Union. And so let's take a quick look at a clip about emancipation policy.
The South had 4 million slaves who were vital in sustaining the Confederate war effort. Although Lincoln had always said a president had no constitutional right to attack slavery, the war had changed all that. As commander-in-chief, he could act out of military necessity.
It doesn't represent a change in his own morality. He says this is a war measure because slaves are essential for the South's war effort. If we can encourage slaves to leave the Southern lines and come to our lines, we will reduce their capacity to make war. And it also comported with his own wish to see all men everywhere free.
In an office of the War Department, Lincoln asked for some paper, saying he wanted to write something special. He then sat down and began writing the Emancipation Proclamation.
He would look out the window a while, then put down a line or two, and then sit quiet for a few minutes. Major Thomas Eckert, War Department.
Lincoln wrote this way for several weeks, adding and revising each day, asking Major Eckert to keep it under lock and key. By late July, Lincoln was ready to show it to his cabinet. The proclamation said that in any state still in rebellion by the start of 1863, all slaves would be declared forever free. Lincoln was careful not to upset the slave-holding border states. The proclamation did not free slaves in Union-held areas, but it did encourage Southern slaves to flee the plantation.
He was as brilliant a public relations strategist as he was a political and military strategist. And he wanted that emancipation to be couched for the American people in terms of saving the Union. Because he knew that issuing it as a gesture toward eventual equality, or certainly toward abolition, was going to be very unpopular. And
okay, so let's talk about some facts about the Emancipation Proclamation. So as the video mentioned here, Lincoln issues it as a military measure. And part of the reason for that is to make sure that it doesn't get before the Supreme Court, that same Supreme Court that had made the Dred Scott decision that we talked about a little bit earlier on here. This is a military measure. It's an action being taken by the president as commander-in-chief. And as they described in the video here. It only freed slaves in areas still in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863. So the classic multiple choice question used to be which document freed the slaves freed all the slaves in America, and oftentimes students would choose Emancipation Proclamation, and that is not accurate. It only freed slaves in areas still in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863. If you were not in rebellion against the Union, remember those border states, right? Missouri, Kentucky, they're not rebelling against the Union. Doesn't free those slaves at all. So, and again, why were they exempted? Because they needed to keep those border states on board. Emancipation was not universally applauded in the North, and the historian that you saw here makes that comment that this is not something that some Northerners actually were willing to fight for. They were willing to fight to save the Union, but not to end slavery. The number of desertions in the Union Army actually goes up for a little bit after the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is not this is a controversial thing. It's important to remember that. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple cartoons about emancipation. So what is this cartoonist point of view? And symbolism is really important in this one. So start the timer here and let you think about that one. So if you look carefully here at some of the symbols in the cartoon, you have Lincoln, and he's actually got his foot on top of a bound copy of the US Constitution. And you'll notice that the inkwell is in the shape of a devil. And in the background here, you have John Brown, who we talked about a little bit earlier on, famous for that Harper's Ferry raid, and also for being part of Bleeding Kansas. And then in the painting, and I know it's a little unclear in the image here, but you have a painting of the slave uprising in the Caribbean, which is showing the Haitian Revolution here. So, so what's the point of view? Not very good, right? The point of view is opposed to emancipation, that this is Lincoln in league with the devil, signing this document, is kind of the point that this cartoon is trying to make. How about this cartoon? Lots of good detail in this one. This is a classic Thomas Nast cartoon where he gives us all kinds of stuff. So you see the family in the middle that is sort of the sun that's glowing. Up in the top here, you see the word emancipation. So this is sort of a left-right kind of thing, before and after. So you have all these terrible things like the dogs being used to chase down slaves in a slave auction, and slaves being beaten here. And over here, you have the former slaves going to school, right? And they are free. So this is certainly a pro emancipation cartoon, celebrating the changes that are happening as a result of Abraham Lincoln. How about this one? This is a challenging one. So you see some Union generals here, and they're trying to beat down the Gyascutus, which is a mythical animal. They're trying to beat it down with a skill and strategy. You see the Secretary of War, Stanton here, who's saying, oh, no, we need a draft to do that. But you'll notice that Lincoln is shaped a lot more like an axe. And of course, this is going back to his days as the log splitter. This is one of the stories about Lincoln's background. And he's saying you can try him with that, but I'm afraid this axe of mine is the only thing that will fetch him. So what is this cartoonist trying to explain to us? The only way to really break the back of the rebellion is, of course, to emancipate slaves, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation here. So this cartoonist is showing some support for that, that despite all these other things that we're doing, emancipation is going to be the thing that's ultimately going to break the rebellion. And so another component of that story is African Americans begin to serve in the Union military. Of course, they're still serving in segregated units, as you can see in the image here. But this really changes the dynamic of the war, that now you have African Americans fighting to end slavery, because the meaning of the war has changed as a result of this. And the most famous of those is the 54th Massachusetts. That was a unit that was drafted in Massachusetts. It was led by Robert Gould Shaw, who you see in the memorial. This is actually a bas-relief sculpture that is in memorial to those men that fought in the 54th Massachusetts. And if you've not seen it, the film Glory is a really great film that tells the story of that unit and all the things that they went through just to get uniforms, just to get weapons, just to get equal pay, and eventually the opportunity to fight for their country, which they did. And you can see, I mean, there's lots of battles where African-American troops were used throughout the Civil War. So it's not just Fort Wagner, which is the main battle that the 54th was involved in. So, so what Lincoln has effectively done here is he's ending slavery, but he's also beginning to use those folks in the Union military, which will help. Remember that population chart I showed you a while back? Certainly changes that. So let's take a look at this. Read through that, see if you can answer this multiple choice question. So what is Douglas saying here? What's he encouraging? How could we interpret this, right? And so the best answer out of those is that the war is about things more than just preserving the Union of the States, that this is a bigger issue than that. This is a war about self-respect and for African Americans. How about this one? What is his point of view in the excerpt? Is he saying African American enlistment would enable the Union to win? Is he saying that white soldiers would accept them as equals? Is he saying that by sacrificing along with white soldiers, that this would advance African-American claims to citizenship? Or is he saying that Northern politicians overwhelmingly favored enlistment of African-Americans? Which one do you think it is? Hopefully you thought it was C, because that seems to be what he's suggesting here, certainly with this. And his rhetoric is interpreted as promoting which of the following? Is he advocating for more soldiers in the Union Army or for equal rights for African Americans? Is he talking about election? Notice he's not saying anything about that here. So what's the best answer here? He's talking about B, that African American soldiers that fight for their country will have all the right to deserve and get equality in the United States, so they should be treated as equal citizens. Now, the meaning of the war is best described by Abraham Lincoln after this very devastating battle that took place over the course of 3 days in July of 1863, a battle at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, where Lee has invaded the North, and there is this massive battle between the two sides that takes place over the course of those 3 days. And this is a photograph I actually took when I was at the battlefield. So if I was a Confederate soldier on the third day, making this very famous march called Pickett's Charge, this is the clump of trees that I would be heading for. So when I took this photograph, I was actually standing just beyond the tree line from where the Confederates marched off. So they actually had to march all this way across an open field against the Union lines on that third day of the battle. And it's a devastating battle. Thousands and thousands of casualties. So in November of 1863, Lincoln is asked to give some remarks at the dedication of a cemetery for all the soldiers that have been killed at that battle. And this is the only photograph that exists of Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address. And you can see him, I kind of labeled him with a little red arrow. There he is right there in the middle of the screen, a little tough to see. But there he is. And the story behind this photograph is that the photographer thought he had all kinds of time to get Lincoln's picture, because most people spoke for an hour, 2 hours at a time in those days. But Lincoln, as you probably know, the Gettysburg Address is less than 300 words. So the photographer scrambled to get at least one photograph of Lincoln here. And that's the only photograph that we have of him giving that speech. So our exam practice, to wrap things up here, is about the Gettysburg Address. So here's the first part of the Gettysburg Address, or at least a little piece of it, right? So what's the situation and what's the purpose of the Gettysburg Address based on this part of the speech? Quick shout out here to Mr. Paul at CCA. And good job for those of you guys that guessed McClellan being the first general on the Twitter feed there. So just based on the first part here, obviously the situation of this is the Battle of Gettysburg, which had happened just a few months before. Many people consider this to be an important turning point of the war, that Lee finally is defeated in a massive battle that takes place there. And the purpose, if we look at just the first part of this, he's saying we're here to dedicate this cemetery. That's what the purpose of the speech is, at least to this point. But notice what he does in the second part. So let's, same questions here, similar questions. What's the purpose? What evidence is there that Lincoln is connecting this to the founding ideals of American democracy? So what is he saying in that second paragraph, especially? Kind of does a nice transition here for us. And he says, you know, in a bigger sense, we can't really hallow the ground that's here. The reason that he seemed to start out by explaining, you know, the first purpose that we talked about on the first slide here. So what is the purpose of this? Well, he's connecting the idea that this war is a war testing whether democracy can survive. Another purpose is to encourage people to be dedicated to winning and finishing the war, that we shouldn't give up now, that as he says here, we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And how else is he connecting this? He talks about a new birth of freedom, which of course people listening to that speech would have known. He's referring to the end of slavery, that America is going to rebirth freedom, much like we had in 1776. And you'll notice that in the first slide, when he says that 77 years ago, that very famous phrase, if you're standing there listening to that speech and you do the math, he's not talking about the Constitution. He's talking about the Declaration of Independence, and that is really what this is all about, is redefining what that declaration was all about and protecting the legacy of that country, including democratic government, which was created by Jefferson in those days. This might be what it would have looked like if it was a tweet. Of course, Lincoln didn't have Twitter in those days, but I thought it was sort of humorous. So let's finish by linking all this together. Get it? Bad dad joke there. So, to summarize things, keys of things to remember. The election of Lincoln in 1860 leads to secession and the start of the Civil War, including the firing on Fort Sumter. The Union won the war despite early Confederate victories. There's a lot of reasons why, and I spent quite a bit of time early on talking about this. Material advantages, they had the banks, they had the railroads, they had more people, just as a couple of early examples. The war began as a war to preserve slavery, to preserve the Union. Let me make sure I got that right. The war began as a war to preserve the Union. It had nothing to do with slavery initially, but shifted to a war to end slavery. The meaning of the war changes, as we mentioned there a little bit. So And Lincoln defined the war against slavery as a fulfillment of American ideals of democracy. In fact, Lincoln once famously said, "I never had a political idea that did not spring from the Declaration of Independence." So those are sort of the things that we talked about today. Good job for those of you guys that got the Twitter question right. Whatever ended up happening to Lee's home, Robert E. Lee had a home in Virginia. You can visit the grounds. It's called Arlington National Cemetery, which is sort of an interesting use of his former plantation there. So those are our keys for today. That wraps up the Civil War. Tomorrow, Ms. Farr will be back to talk about Reconstruction and wrapping up all of period 5. So our practice question for tomorrow is this political cartoon that you may have seen. Maybe your teacher shared this with you. The first vote. What's the historical significance of this cartoon? So that's something for you to think about for between today and tomorrow. Thanks again for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you again real soon.